All right, everybody. Well, we may have other folks joining us. This is another one of our Zoom calls where we've invited in supporters of the podcast on Patreon. And I have my friend and sparring partner and co-host Bill Scher of Politico Magazine also here, and then seen a whole bunch of friendly and familiar faces, our regulars like Jonathan there, and of course we are very happy. I think we got a big turnout today because a return guest of a recent guest, but a hit episode, David Frum, who's the author of Trumpocalypse, which is a great new book. I'm holding it up now. If you're watching us on YouTube or Zoom, this not only a great book, but a pretty awesome cover. David Frum, welcome back to the news.
Thank you so much. Thank you for holding up the book.
My pleasure. You know, we talked last time about having a book that comes out like in a pandemic, and I was wondering maybe this isn't good timing, but I think, look, none of us likes what is happening in America today, but if you write a book that's critical of Donald Trump, maybe you couldn't have picked a better time.
Well, I don't know from a commercial point of view how it works. We'll find out fairly soon. Psychologically, I mean, authorship is a pretty inward experience, and you're locked in a study, and you're in your own head for a lot of the time. And even if you've taken a lot of notes, you're with those. But the reward you have is you finish the book, and then you'll be let loose, and you'll be able to travel around the country and meet people and talk to people and go places you might not otherwise have gone before. And no, that's all taken away. I am promoting this book in exactly the same room where I wrote the book. So I have no sense of, and you know, it's wonderful to talk to you on Zoom, but you don't have that sense of being out meeting people the way, which is the usual reward for authorship.
Well, you know, the easy thing to do would be to bash Donald Trump. I you know, have done quite well of late attacking Donald Trump. There's plenty of material. There's really no. You know, he's asking for it. But I wanted to start by actually asking maybe a more challenging question, which is, you know, there's this thing that every time the left would do something crazy, I would say, this is how we got Trump, or this is how you get Trump. And I'm a little worried right now. We're seeing things like the slogan, defund the police. We're seeing this issue with the New York Times the New York Times staffers basically intimidating management and editors there about the Tom Cotton op-ed. I'd love to get are you worried about this as I am?
Well, let me separate those two issues, because the Tom Cotton issue is more, look, one of the reasons I'm very grateful to work at The Atlantic rather than any place else, and especially not the New York Times, is, look, everyone who works for The Atlantic thinks The Atlantic is a fun and interesting place to work. But nobody thinks The Atlantic is the most important story on earth. And our internal workings are the things we should spend our days thinking about. Whereas this is an occupational hazard that seems to afflict people at the New York Times. It's too interesting for its own good. So, you know, from my point of view, when we think about how much work it took The Atlantic to get the James Mattis statement, and how the New York Times just fluked into this whole thing, the Tom Cotton statement, like that's the second most discussed op-ed of the week. And if you have the second most, I mean, we got the most discussed op-ed of the week, and it took a lot of work. But if you fluke into the second most discussed op-ed, that's a success if everyone's talking about your op-ed, not a failure.
Right.
But look, that's a tempest in a teapot. The defund the police thing is much more serious. I mean, that really is. If there's one idea that could really help Trump, that really is it. And I had a tweet about this today where I put it in quote marks, defund the police, ! And then with an asterisk, this message brought to you by the private security contractors of the United States of America. Because you know, all you're doing with this idea is, you know, you're empowering, you know, it's like one of the great not thinking it through. And to the extent that the idea is sensible, which is obviously it makes the police are your last line of resort. You want to make sure that you've invested in early childhood education and nutrition programs and all the things that keep people away from the law enforcement system. That if that's the message, that's all good. But if you're saying I don't know, before your last thought on this, anyway. It just seems an overly dramatic statement, but of a memorable kind that could really get into the public head and seem disqualifying.
Yeah, and at a time when Donald Trump is so bad, you would think everyone would be united to get him out of office, and this could complicate it. So thank you, everybody who has joined us. And I think what we'll do is Bill Scher and I are going to maybe take turns asking some questions of David, and then we'll open it up. And
thank you.
Probably,
that's exciting.
Just like last time, David, when we kind of had a conversation, I'll just maybe bring in people one at a time. Let me ask you this. I want to be respectful of your time. Do you have a hard out today?
No, I'm fine. So thank you. I'm respectful of your time, and I'm grateful for the invitation.
All right. Well, Bill Scher, take it away.
Thanks for doing this, David. I'm curious if you saw the article in the New Republic by David Cleon, which was partially a review of your book and partially a lament. For those who don't know, he's very much on the left, not a huge Biden fan, although I don't think he's quite never Biden. But he looked at the movement of never Trump conservatives into the Biden column and argued that Biden is proving to be more receptive to never Trump conservatives than he is to pro-Bernie leftists. And this is an indication of the ideological direction of the Democratic Party. So I just want to get your general reaction to that. And more specifically, do you think that people like you or you yourself actually does have or is making direct impact on Joe Biden, his platform, and the party itself?
Well, your second question presents me with a dangerous dilemma as a Washingtonian in good standing. Because what you've asked me is, are you a dramatically more important person than there is any objective indication of you being? And the natural Washington is, well, yes, I will absolutely let everybody know I am, in fact, a super secret, super powerful person. So I don't talk to the Biden campaign. I don't give them advice. I can't imagine that they would listen if I do. And I think there's a lot of the parts of that review that were about me personally just seem like little rabbit pellets to feed your delusions of grandeur. And as I say, it's a tasty dish, but it's not very realistic. But where to the larger point, why did the Democrats win the House in 2018? Did they win it by having won all of the congressional seats in the Bay Area, then invent new congressional seats in the Bay Area to win those? Did they add, invent, and insert extra seats into Portland, Oregon, and Brooklyn? No, the Democrats won the House by making huge gains in conservative-leaning suburbs, especially with the votes of women in those areas, and by presenting them with an acceptable alternative. So that he's got a quarrel here with sort of the political math of the country. The proposition that there are enormous numbers of hidden votes out there for a true socialist message has been tested again and again by the Bernie Sanders people. And it's not true. It flunked even in the Democratic primaries. And what you saw was, it's not that there's no one there. It's not that it's nothing. It's not that they don't have any clout, but that if you want to put together the size of majority you need to win the House of Representatives and to win the presidency, that conservative-leaning suburban districts are going to be very, very important, and much more important than piling up more votes in Brooklyn, San Francisco, and Portland.
I mean, I've been on that same tip for a long time. I've argued for a couple of years now that the party was more moderate than people thought, and I think that's been borne out by what happened in the primary. But I guess David Frum is probably a few ticks to the right of still the average moderate Democrat.
Sure.
So is it possible that if there's more David Frums who are vocally supporting Biden, would they pull Biden even more to the right? Would there be a more hawkish foreign policy than otherwise because David Frum is behind Biden and Biden is listening to David Frum more than other Democrats?
Look, Biden is a person with an enormous political operation and very deep roots. And he's also got a very strong brand identity of his own, and he's also got very strong beliefs of his own. So he's going to be who he is. And but I think it's also true that the future of the Democratic Party is going to be very much up for grabs. The future of our whole political system is very much up for grabs. We get one scenario where the Democrats win narrowly, and another scenario where they win big. The bigger they win, the more powerful their left will be. Because if they win narrowly, then everything will depend on the votes of the 2 most conservative Democratic senators and the 13 most conservative Democratic members of the House. If they have a bigger majority in both those bodies, then they can go farther to the left. And that then creates opportunities for the Republicans to reinvent themselves. If the Republicans suffer a big defeat, it will be totally discrediting to Donald Trump. If it's a narrow defeat, the Trumpists will say, oh, it's just the bad luck of the pandemic. If he loses Colorado by 20 points, if he loses a Senate seat in Georgia, if he loses electoral votes in Arizona and North Carolina, then the party has to look itself in the mirror. And then as the Democrats move left and as the Republicans rethink, that those of us in the never Trump world find ourselves probably going back to the Republican Party to take part in, post-war Reconstruction. But if it's a narrow scenario and Tom Cotton or Don Jr. or Dan Crenshaw becomes the face of post-Trumpism after Trump, then it's a different story.
Hey, David, last time you were on, which was like a month ago, maybe a couple months ago, you were basically making the argument that because of COVID-19 and social distancing, that the economy was obviously a big problem and that it could take a long time for the economy to recover. But since then, we've seen reports that some Democrats are worried that the economy could bounce back very quickly, right? Because it's not like a normal recession. It's been kept artificially low, but the economy, we've artificially hurt the economy, and once we open things up, it could bounce back quicker. We've seen just today the unemployment rate not as bad as we maybe thought it would be. What's your take? Have you revised your position on that?
I don't think so. But let me just recapitulate it to be clear. I mean, look, a lot of this is like a natural disaster, and so the first layers of things that return are going to be pretty easy. I mean, that you have the banks with good balance sheets, that kind of thing. But what we have seen in every recovery since the end of the Cold War, recovery from the recession of 1990, the recovery of from the Great Recession, is that those two recessions, after those 2 recessions, the recovery. Sorry, I forgot 2000 and 2001. It just takes us much longer time to get back to full employment than it did before 1990, and probably that has to do with the fact that so many people work for small service companies that are smaller companies that are easier put out of business. This is not the world where you get called back. Bethlehem Steel lays you off. You live in a steel town, things get better, Bethlehem Steel calls you back. That the kind of people who, if you work in a restaurant, if you work in a hotel that's gone out of business, you have to wait for the business to restart. And I think there's just been enough damage to the companies that I don't see us getting back to full employment so fast, which is not to say, you couldn't have the first tranche is big and fast. But to get back to 4% or less unemployment from where we are, I can't. There's no way that happens before November. It would be great if that happens before the end of 2021, but even that may be optimistic. Yeah,
I mean, I don't think full employment, but if I think a couple months ago, a lot of us were assuming we're going to be looking at a 20% unemployment rate. If it's 10% and it looks like Trump has turned things around, he could still lose, but the economy may not factor in.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to like over-interpret. I'm about to give you a couple of data points. I don't want to over-interpret it because a lot of this, I'm sure, is just coincidence. But the president to win re-election with the highest unemployment rate was Barack Obama in 2012. The unemployment rate was 7.7%, and he just made it. The next president, then you go through the risk. Okay, so what happens if you go a little north of 7.7? Well, in 1976, Gerald Ford ran for re-election with 7.8% unemployment in the month of November, and he lost. Now, I'm not going to argue that like 7.7, you're safe, 7.8, too much. There are always other things going on. But it just gives you an idea of how, when you're in the sevens, how touch and go things are. Momentum matters. In 1984, when Ronald Reagan was massively reelected, the unemployment rate on election day was 7.2%. But the economy had been so strong for the previous 12 months that people really were optimistic. Can you imagine, will you have that kind of strength going into, can it start right away and can it go off like a rocket? I suppose it's not impossible, but it does look like by the time the kind of person who's going to decide this election begins to feel confident about the economy, we're well past voting day.
David, it seems like there's increasing expectation that Trump is likely to lose and that Republicans are starting to think about the post-Trump GOP. I know Matt's written about this and Matt and I have talked about it in the past. But do you have a sense of both, one, what do you think the state of that discussion is right now in Republican and conservative circles? Are they going to remain a Trumpist party, or will they try to put Trump in the rearview mirror? And two, regardless of what the current state of the dialogue is, do you have a prediction where you think it would go upon Trump actually losing?
Well, you can see individual politicians putting down individual markers, right? So you have a Tom Cotton saying, "Well, what if Trump were, had a military background and were, more consistently principled and more consistently connected to traditional conservative foreign policy? Would that work if you took the domestic Trumpism at home and joined it to pre-Trumpism abroad? Would that work?" And Nikki Haley is saying, what if you've maintained personally good relations with Donald Trump, but that's it? And Ben Sass says, well, what if you've been mildly critical of Donald Trump? Will that work? So different politicians are trying different methods, and we will see. We won't know who's in the right until we know the magnitude of the defeat. If it's narrow, then I think Tom Cotton begins to look very compelling to a lot of people. If it's crushing, then he sure doesn't. My own views on this are pretty idiosyncratic in the Republican world, so I don't know that there's going to be a lot of take up. But I want to see a multi-ethnic, culturally modern party of industry and commerce that is a party of a party in which there are lots of. I am not baffled that people who are economically struggling don't vote Republican. I am baffled, the Indian immigrant who owns 16 hotels. Why doesn't he vote Republican? And the answer is because we keep insulting him. Or that's a big part of the answer. So is there some way to take the core center-right message and make it more modern, culturally modern, more multi-ethnic?
Is it just a question of how big the defeat is? Is it possible that Trump has so changed the basic DNA of the average Republican that it wouldn't matter if he loses by 10 points and it's an electoral college landslide? They don't care if they win or lose. They just want to fight the fight.
Yeah, but what you're going to find out is if the defeat is bad enough, politicians start to think, you know what, we just don't have the numbers here. We just don't have the numbers here. And one of the points I make in Trumpocalypse is it's not just that Trump's numbers are bad, but that because they are based in so many of the less economically dynamic parts of the country. It's that those people in the Republican world who want to have a certain kind of business-oriented message just find they don't have the voters. I mean, you can't build a party of enterprise on the votes of people who are most suspicious of enterprise. And that is where the party has been through the Trump years. It's been a real a real problem. And as I said, we don't know how big the defeat is going to be and who's going to look promising afterwards or not. And we also don't know what is going to happen in the next years, because regeneration usually happens in response to new conditions, not just as a reaction to the mistakes of 4 years ago. And so we'll see, does the economy grow smartly under a Biden administration or does it not? And how successful are Democrats at containing some of their own, as Matt said, there's some of their own boutique social movements. I mean, if the Democratic Party really does become a party of, we are mistrustful of policing, that we are going to adopt all kinds of culturally forward boutique policies, that could, that they could make it easy for the Republicans to bounce back.
All right, I have one more question, and then I'm going to throw it open, and we'll do ladies first. I think this is the first or second time we've actually had more than one lady on a Zoom call. I see. So I'm going to, in a minute, I will go to Carrie and Laura if they have questions. But David, I heard you recently, well, and I know you wrote a very highly regarded book about the 1970s. Obviously, some people are comparing this moment to 1968, and I heard you recently talk about how Trump is not Richard Nixon, but he is George Wallace or Mayor Daley, and I thought that was a really interesting analogy, and I'd love for you to talk about that and see if anything's changed since you said that a couple days ago.
Well, thank you. I recommend people go and watch Nixon's famous Law and Order ad, which I linked to in the article I wrote, and it's pretty easy to find on YouTube. What you'll see is that I don't think there's a single black face in that ad, and certainly not in the foreground. And Nixon contrasts in his Law and Order ad student radicals and Chicago police. And he is trying to make it clear he doesn't like either. The picture, because there are many of the scenes in the ad come from a police riot at the Democratic Convention in 1968. And every picture of the police that Nixon shows is unflattering. They have he's chosen police. There's the one picture with quite an overweight policeman who's wearing a helmet that's too small for his head. Other policemen are shooting tear gas from guns that are too small for their meaty hand. They look ridiculous. They look both brutal and ridiculous. And then there are a number of pictures of very clean cut looking young people bleeding from the head, having been hit. And what Nixon is saying in this ad is, look, student radicals, bad. And maybe he's saying student radicals standing in for racial turbulence, bad. But also, remember, Mr. and Mrs. America, that Mayor Daley is a Democrat. And Mayor Daley was crucial to getting the nomination for John F. Kennedy in 1960. So Nixon's triangulating. A thing to bear in mind, we all know about Watergate and the Nixon presidency and Nixon's character, but if you were an American voter in 1968, the most important thing you knew about Richard Nixon was that he had been Eisenhower's vice president. He was the vice president from a time of domestic peace. And when in many ways, he's in the shoes of Joe Biden. That Nixon was saying in 1968, look at all this turmoil that has erupted in the country since our team left office. It was when we were there, it was all quiet. When we were there, we got out of Korea in 6 months after taking over. We're going to do that again. We're going to restore quiet the way Eisenhower did. We're going to get out of Vietnam the way Eisenhower got out of Korea. And that's what it means to be a Republican. And that was and I condemn both student radicals and the police brutality. I condemn, and I'm standing here in between Hubert Humphrey and George Wallace. And Nixon's speech, Trump in 2016 claimed that he was modeling his acceptance address on Nixon's, but he didn't read, or whoever did it didn't read Nixon's address or didn't pay attention, because Nixon's theme through that 1968 address was, just as there can be no justice without order, so there can be no order without justice. And the end of the speech is a series of parallel sentences about reaffirming the importance of there not being violence, but also reaffirming his commitment to doing something about the underlying causes of social turmoil. Nixon was triangulating, and he was not appealing to the most reactionary people in the United States. Those were Wallace voters.
That is so interesting. So you're saying Joe Biden's Nixon? I'm not sure that's good.
Well, no, I'm not. But look, the point is that this kind of like there's this facile thing that people do where they come up with easy historical parallels. And I think the most important thing to remember always is the advice that was given me by a great historian who's a teacher of mine in college. History never repeats itself. It only appears to do so if you don't pay attention to the details.
Yeah. All right. Carrie, who hails from the great city of Seattle, but I believe is on the road on some sort of a road trip. First question though for Carrie, before you ask David a question, is how are you feeling about Bill Scher's new look?
I was trying to go like this, but I didn't want you guys to see my new look, which is horrible. Yeah, it's very Seattle-ish, Bill.
I was trying to honor Petrusia, who's not here today for some reason.
That's the Petrusia.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
I love it.
It's not going to last. It's been wildly reviled in my household, so it can't stay for very long.
Oh.
I just have advice to not hang out at any grade school parking lots with that. I'm just kidding.
Okay. So, Carrie, you don't have
I wish I had it.
we won't ask you to disclose your location because I know you're possibly on the run, definitely on the road. Any questions for David Frum?
I feel like a big fat jerk because I don't have a really cool question, and you have so many nice. There's so many nice people on, so I will defer to them. But I did want you to know I brought the book with me for my retreat.
Yes,
so.
That's right. Thank you, Carrie.
So I got to speed read through that thing.
My son right now is driving from his home in Los Angeles to catch up with us here in Washington, D.C. So I hope it's not as long a road trip as that. But.
No, I just snuck across the border to Oregon because I had to get away for a little bit from the law.
Good.
Okay, I'll let you guys talk.
Great.
I'm glad to see you guys. Thank you. I'll go mute.
Great to see you, Carrie. And then Laura, who occasionally sneaks to Montana, but I think she's in Salt Lake City today. How's it going?
I am in Salt Lake, drinking a huckleberry hard cider.
Yes.
Brought here from Montana, made in Oregon. I'm okay. The view from Utah is very white, and I'm just have had a lot of thoughts in my head between I grew up in Cleveland, went to school in Philly, and then moved out west. Very different demographics to experience the current climate in. But I don't have any questions. This is really an honor to be live with David and both of you as well, and everyone else. So thank you.
Where in Utah are you?
Salt Lake.
And is it quiet there? Or are there commotions in Salt Lake too?
It is quiet here. I don't live downtown, but I live in the city, and we did have a curfew imposed that was supposed to run through Sunday, but the mayor lifted it 2 days ago. So that started last Saturday night and maybe ran Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. But there was some unrest. There was a 5-hour long Zoom city council meeting with 200 residents giving comment. And I think it was very well received from what I read. So it's calmed down here and government's being receptive.
Well, glad you're doing well, Laura. And I think, is Scott in West Virginia, right?
Yes, I am.
We had you're a long ways from me. We just had a major downpour here in the Eastern Panhandle, but good to see you.
We had it last night. I will make one comment and ask a question.
You're not gonna get us into a fight about the Electoral College, are you?
No. But I would like to talk about gerrymandering, maybe. No. I work in manufacturing. Which is probably different from what most of certainly the pundits are doing, and I would agree that this is not going to be the impact on, and I work for a major, corporate, international company, and the impact has been worse and swifter and more impactful than the 2008 downturn, which was outstandingly bad. And so I think people should be prepared for a fairly negative economic situation for a while, be
Yeah.
my perspective.
Yeah, well, if you work in manufacturing, I think the hope of some of the more economically sophisticated people around the president was that they hoped this would be like 1958. So that's the first 1958 is the first bad recession after World War II, and I don't understand all of it. But there's a crisis in the automobile industry. That was the year of the Edsel. General Motors had some other trouble as well, and so there are huge layoffs through the auto industry. And in those days, when you laid off people on the auto lines, it just reverberated then through parts and through the whole industrial Midwest. And then they retooled, and Ford replaced the Edsel, and they had a good year. The auto industry had a good year in '59, and so the parts and everything came back. And just as deep as the economy went into the trench, it came out of the trench that fast in '59, '60. Although not fast enough to save Richard Nixon in 1960. Richard Nixon always blamed the recession of '58 for his loss to John F. Kennedy. But the modern economy just doesn't work like that anymore. I mean, we just don't have those kinds of, and we have some very large businesses, but the large businesses tend to, except for UPS maybe and Walmart, they tend to not have a lot of employees. And meanwhile, people work for industries that that don't have the kind of capital resources that Ford, Chrysler, and GM had in 1958. If a restaurant with 13 people goes out of business, those 13 people don't get called back because the restaurant doesn't come back.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to ask a question of, not to say things aren't really off the rails already, but there's been, discussions about, Trump doing things that are, demanding of the military to do things. What's your view of things really going off the rail, that he makes demands and some portion of the police and or military support him and some part don't?
Well, Matt very kindly, just before our talk, tweeted out the relevant passage in Trumpocalypse. The military has been signaling for a while, leave us out of this. I mean, Trump always makes these comments about the military is with me. After Charlottesville, which happened on a weekend, of course, the first major American figure to tweet a condemnation, an implicit condemnation of the president's remarks, was not a corporate leader. It was the chief of naval operations. And then was followed by every one of the service chiefs within the next 2 days. So they all tweeted out, we want no part of this. Remember how the military just evaded Trump's demand for a big parade on Pennsylvania Avenue. And they coming up with reasons why they couldn't do it. Each more ingenious than the last. Like, well, if we use our big vehicles, it'll tear up the streets in the District of Columbia. The District of Columbia will send us a bill, and we don't have a line item where we can repave Pennsylvania Avenue. So Congress will have to give us a new defense budget with a repaving authority. And it was obviously they didn't want to do it because it was so nakedly political. And now we've seen most dramatically in the past few days, the military saying, we do not want to be part of this. So I think it's finally penetrated President Trump's consciousness that the military, they don't love him. They don't love him. And the rank of, and they're not political. Even if they did love him, they wouldn't do the things that he wants them to do. And as it happens, they don't love him. Here in DC, I've been wandering around the streets. I didn't do it today because of the downpour you mentioned. But I've spent a lot of time wandering around. And what you're struck by is there's this presence of people who don't look like military people at all. They don't have, we now know they're from the riot police and the Bureau of Prisons. And they don't have the smartness of soldierly bearing. They're not deployed in rational ways. I mean, you want to close a street, you put down a piece of yellow tape and put two National Guard beside that yellow tape. No one's going to cross that yellow tape. You don't need to line people up like, stormtroopers in Star Trek. But that's what they, that's what they've done.
Star Wars, yeah.
I think that was it. Oh, sorry, Star Wars. Thank you. Oops.
if we don't call you out on it now, the commenters will.
Right. But I think the things to be worried about are private actors, and I think the thing to be really focused on is if the election is close and Trump challenges the election, what happens? How much mischief can he make? I mean, he's got a deadline, which is there will be a day in mid-December when the Electoral College meets and certifies a winner. And once there's a winner certified, it's over. That at that point he can make trouble, but he can't change the outcome. But until the Electoral College meets, he can cast a big shadow over the next administration.
If I can jump in with a totally different topic. Since you've long been associated with the phrase axis of evil from the Bush administration involving Iran, North Korea, Barack Obama got elected very much with a different approach. At least what he campaigned on was that he was going to have very aggressive diplomacy to both countries, which didn't quite materialize exactly as was formulated in the campaign, but he did have the Iran deal. He couldn't make much headway with North Korea. Now Trump has come in, reversing that, pulling out of the Iran deal, but reaching out to North Korea. What advice would you have for either an incoming Biden administration or for the Republican Party going forward and dealing with these two countries with the chess pieces arranged as they are today?
Yeah. Well, North Korea, as I stand right now, the countries present very, very different situations. I mean, North Korea is just a basket case of a place. Humanitarian disaster. They had terrible famine in the middle 1990s, and it's run by this sort of military clique that are just extracting wealth, but on such a tiny level compared to the wealth that is available to them if they had anything like an economy. So their strategy, the grand strategy of North Korea, is just to be obnoxious enough to blackmail people into paying attention to them and giving them money. And so I don't think there's ever any diplomacy you can do with them, because the outcome of diplomacy, which is to find some way to live together, they're not interested in that. They're interested in being obnoxious and extracting money and being as militarily assertive as it takes to make people notice them. The very thing we want, which is never to think about North Korea again, is the thing they want to deny us. And so I think that just continues on its way until some event happens where somebody decides, some general pulls off a successful operation where he says, I'd rather have 2% of what you could get out of North Korea if it were as rich as South Korea than 80% of what you get when North Korea is as poor as North Korea. And someday that will happen, and then there'll be a unification, and that'll be a big problem. Iran is a different situation. I mean, Iran is one of the great civilizations of the world, with a very lively civil society, and people who we don't know in what proportions exactly, but near enough to make a tussle out of elections like 2009. People who very much want to participate in the modern world, and they may not agree with us about everything, but they'd like to have a bigger say in how their government works. They'd like it to be honest. They'd like it, to be able to walk down the street holding hands with their girlfriend and boyfriend and not be harassed. They want to, and I think that is a case where you have just the thinnest layer, most fragile layer of repression over a very dynamic society. And the question I have right now is, how discredited are the repressors by the COVID-19? Iran suffered so terribly badly, and there was such a terrible cover-up. Does that have political consequences that can be fruitful for the future? I don't assert that. I asked that.
Jonathan is raising his hand, which is actually a good point, because we're now 40 minutes into this. So if you have a question, maybe raise your hand, or there's the chat function. You could ping me and I'll call on you. Jonathan, yes.
So, David, first of all, thank you for being here. I just want to say that the only reason why I haven't read your first book is because I'm in the middle of a dilemma, physical or audible. Yeah, very tough decision. I wanted.
Well, David, do you read the book, the audio book?
I read the introduction to the first book, Trumpocalypse, and I read all of Trumpocalypse, and which I was really delighted to do and very happy about.
I just wanted, this is actually a question for Matt, David, and Bill. This past week, I think in terms of all the bad news that we had a bit of good news in Republican Party politics. Congressman Steve King of Iowa went down to defeat against conservative Randy Feenstra. And I can tell you, I've had a lot of my conservative friends are celebrating this. I've had friends on the left who are saying, well, this guy's just Steve King light. And I'm just curious, is this good news for the GOP, or is there still a long way for the GOP to go to getting back to conservatism and a sense of normalcy?
I think it's a straw in the wind. And I mean, it for the moment, and this has been true for a bit, that it's sort of constrained. President Trump's options are limited, that there's a part of, if not him, then there are people around him who were interested in a purer form of white nationalism. I think that's going to be off the table. I think that the real big step comes when, as in the joke about the light bulb, when the light bulb decides it wants to change. That there is the Republican approach to the constituencies that don't like it has been to explain to them why they're wrong. And so there's a lot of stuff on the internet, Black Americans, you're just wrong. You're on this democratic slave plantation and you don't understand how wrong you are. Let us explain to you why we are right, you are wrong. And that never goes well. I mean, politics always starts with an act of listening. And you have to really internalize what people are concerned about. And we have to accept that politicians and the voters have a division of labor. That the job of the voters is to identify the problems, and the job of the politicians is to identify the solutions. And you get it wrong either way. When the voters identify the solutions, that's when you get trade protectionism, where people think it sounds like a good idea and it's not. But when the politicians refuse to hear people saying what they're distressed about. By the way, this is a problem that people on the left have. I mean, through that people on the left, the voters say we're worried about crime. And people on the left say, well, that's racist. Or we're worried about immigration. That's racist. You're not allowed to be worried about the things you're worried about. They're not going to stop being worried about the things they worry about because you scold them. You have to accept their worries as given and then compete between the parties to propose solutions.
Isaac has a question about China. I'd love to get your take on China. Like, should we be in a Cold War with them? But Isaac wants to know about how Trump is kind of demagoguing the issue and how Biden should respond to the China question.
Is Isaac coming on?
No,
that's basically all I wanted.
You want to?
Oh.
I just wanted you to riff on China. I'm just curious what your latest opinions are.
Well, I think it's hard for us to process the speed with which the world around China has changed. And here's a dramatic way to put it. When I worked in the Bush administration, which was not even yet fully 20 years ago, Chinese economy was about 1/3 the size of the United States. It was an important country, but it was by no means an equal of the United States. And we could do that. And all of the foreign policy of the Bush administration in the Middle East was based on that it didn't matter whether the Chinese objected or not, because there was nothing really they could do about it. So flash forward not even 20 years, and if the Chinese economy is not yet quite equal to the United States, very soon it will be. And I think very few of our leaders have yet adjusted to a world in which China is a peer country. And this is such a new thing because the United States faced great power competition with the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union had a shambles of an economy. It faced obviously great power competition with Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. They both had shambles of an economy. And some people in the 1980s thought we had a competition with Japan. I didn't think so, but we did. So there are people who did.
Donald Trump among them.
Donald Trump among them. But Japan had an economy, but no military capacity. This is the first time since the Kaiser that the United States has faced a peer country that is both militarily and economically capable. And it's much more an equal of the United States than the Kaiser ever was. So it's a completely new problem. In the modern, or not, well, there's a very new problem. And so my view of it is you have to take this country seriously as a rival. But precisely because it is so big and powerful, you have to be very careful about provoking it. And so Donald Trump believes two things, which is one, China is this huge, powerful, dangerous country, and two, we should just harass it and bother it and alienate all our allies. And if you're facing a big, a big counterpart, you have to have a very prudent policy. So I am all for taking seriously that this is a potential rivalry. You want it to go as peacefully as it possibly can, and that means it's very important to amass as many friends as possible. I have a scenario in Trumpocalypse of, and this is maybe, it'll sound science fiction-y, but it's really not. So the Chinese are taking on board that their emissions are creating a global climate problem, and China is very exposed to climate problems. That South China gets hit by, terrible tropical storms, and North China is suffering, sinking water tables, aridity, decline in its agricultural production. Fixing global warming is a very expensive thing to do, and China can't really afford it. They're looking for a poor man's way to solve global warming, and the idea that they are seriously experimenting with is putting sunlight reflecting particles into the atmosphere to lower solar radiation coming to Earth and thus cooling the planet. You don't have to think very hard to imagine all the ways that that plan could go terribly wrong. But Indian scientists have modeled one way it could go wrong is if you do it wrong, you could change all the rainfall in North India. So what happens when the Chinese are getting close to being ready to do this and the Indians start squawking and objecting? I mean, you could have real conflict, worse than conflict. And so the United States has to think, as China becomes more powerful, that if it wants to get better behavior out of China, it's going to have to work with others in a way that we've gotten out of the habit of since the end of the Cold War.
All right, we got a couple people. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just kind of ask a quick follow-up. If, a lot of people think that China is not as powerful, like they don't trust the economic numbers they're putting out. And so I just wonder, pushback. So you have more faith in that China is going to continue in a legit superpower and not just kind of a,
I always speak, when I speak about China, I always speak very approximately. The formula I use is, nearly equal to the United States, and soon will be equal. If it is to be blurry, because the numbers are. I mean, we've all seen those pictures of the empty, condo towers in Chinese cities, and look, I think in a real full-bore contest of power, American power is greater, including, we have a more cohesive society. We can deploy our military. We can deploy our military on the coast of China. They cannot deploy their military on the coast of the United States. We don't have to worry about civil unrest. And our military is invested in deployable power. Their military is mostly invested in domestic control. So, and obviously, we're richer. We have more. We have the power of the dollar, capital markets. It wouldn't be. Let me put it this way. But it would be much more like Britain in 1914 was stronger than Germany, but it wasn't comfortably stronger than Germany. And it would be like that. We are stronger than China, but I'd rather not find out how much stronger. And the way to not find out is to say our job is to build in the Pacific the kind of structures we had in the Atlantic. It will be harder. India is probably our most important partner, and they are going to be a lot more difficult to work with than our European partners ever were. They are a lot more difficult, and their politics, by the way, are evolving in an illiberal and undemocratic direction. So it'll be even harder there. But I want to say, what is the basic take? The basic take is precisely because I am very wary of China. I want to avoid highly confrontational policies with China, and I want to hope for the best, because it's not, one of the things is all the foreign policy crises that we've forgotten about because nobody did anything hasty. And if you can get past the crisis without doing anything hasty, then maybe things work out. And let's keep trying to hope that things will work out with the Chinese and that we can share the planet very comfortably with them.
All right, I've got a question in the queue, but if you have a question, you can chat or raise your hand, and I'll call on you. We'll go for a bit more. I do want to say, if you're listening to this or watching this, and you like long form, smart conversation, and you want to support this, and you want to be maybe a part of one of these calls, go to patreon.com/Matt Lewis, or Bill Scher. You want to plug the other way to get in on this?
You guys, you can join my Patreon, patreon.com/Bill Scher, and you'll have access to all these wonderful Zoom chats that Matt does and I do.
Yeah, Bill and I do every week. Usually, if we don't have a guest, we just debate each other and often get along, but sometimes we spar. I also want to say, if you want to help us continue to get top-notch guests, this is how you do it. Get the book, Trumpocalypse. Buy the books, and then people will they'll be contacting us. I don't have to email them. They'll be coming to us. We have, is it Hudson?
Yeah, my first name is Dale. I'm using a school Google.
Dale, where are you in the world?
I'm actually in Orange County, California. So you were talking earlier about the Democrats going after swing districts, and I live in Harley-Rivers district, which had, I've lived here 20 years and assumed I would never, ever have a Democratic congressman. But now I do.
Orange County was once the most Republican county in America. Are you a Matt Lewis or a Bill Scher patron?
Well, actually both. So I could do a commercial for you folks. Yeah, I just joined recently, but I just joined to support you, and I had no idea I was going to get to talk to interesting guests as well. So this is
fire away, Dale. This is your moment.
Thank you. So David, this is my question. If you have an opinion, Trump voters, how would you divide them between three groups? One is the people who really kind of think he's an honest guy and a good guy. The people who see he's kind of a dishonest guy and a bad guy, but they tolerate it because they like his policies. And the people who like him because he is a bad guy. He's a bad guy, but he's our bad guy.
That's so interesting. I don't know that I can give you numbers on that, obviously, but it's always worth grappling with how far away politics seems to most people. And the way I keep this in check is I always think about it in terms of sports. That for me, I know approximately the season of the year when the Super Bowl is played, and by about a couple of weeks before, I will have an idea of what are the names of the team, what cities the teams in it are from, and maybe a day or two out, I'll be able to name one or two of the players. And then if my son's here and he's having a party with his friends, I'll wander in and watch the last 15 minutes of the game and have a snack, and marvel at whatever happens in the last 15 minutes of the game. I think that's how most people think about politics. They are as hazy about it as I am about the National Football League, maybe even more hazy. And it's also important to remember how much that partisanship in the United States is associated with broader indicators of cultural identity. And people just vote Republican because they just, that's just who we are. That's who our kind of folk are. And people vote Democrat in the same way. So I think a great many of the people who voted for Trump in 2016 voted for him because the Clinton brand was strong, and they were on the other side of that brand. They were Republican type people, and they then made rational excuses for him. And they didn't know that much. They didn't know that much about him. And when they saw him behaving badly, and in a way that they would condemn if someone who was a nonpartisan or not a co-partisan behavior, they had all kinds of permission structures to make up. But what I do think is true among people who are more closer to politics, and I've seen this among especially among men of my approximate age and approximate position in life, that there are people who find his bad behavior emancipating. There's just no way around it, who sort of chuckle at it, who get excited by it. He puts people in their place who deserve to be put in their place. And I think we're talking about in the tens or hundreds of thousands of highly involved people who enjoy the brutality of it. And most people just have a sense that he's on the side of people like them in a world in which people want to take things away. I mean, a way to think about this is there was a story that during the Tea Party that people would carry a sign that said, "Keep the government's hands off my Medicare." Now, there are photographs of that sign, but in every case where it's photographed, the person is carrying it ironically. It's not clear to me that anyone actually ever carried the sign non-ironically. But if anyone ever did, it would not have been a stupid thing to say, because who else but the government is going to touch your Medicare?
All right, we got a couple questions in the queue here. Todd, I see your question, but I'll let you ask it.
Okay. What I've noticed over the last, bit is that it seems that for the Trump administration and for conservatives in general, every story is like it's a media story. So like Lindsey Graham's reaction to Jim Mattis's comments was about his potential, like being seduced by the left media. And, like there was a debate about, did the media represent the Lafayette Park incident right? Because they called it tear gas, but it was actually smoke canisters and like pepper ball riot agents, which strikes me as beside the point. But my question is that, like, is making the media a front and center issue a winning strategy for Trump, or is it simply like a base-oriented thing? And I'd be happy to hear answers from that from from David, Matt, and from Bill.
Matt and Bill, do you have a view?
Well, I think that the media is very unpopular, and I think as a member of the media, I think we're very unpopular. I think the media invites some problems, and I do think that it's a good strategy for Trump to try to discredit the media talking about fake news, because then how do you hold him accountable? What do you think, Bill?
Can you restate the question one more time?
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess that like every issue, I shouldn't say every issue, many issues get boiled down to an issue of like how the media is covering that issue. So it's not the fact that like people were smoked out of, dispersed in Lafayette Park. It's how the media reported on it.
Was it really tear gas?
Yeah, it's not what Jim Mattis said. Is it? Did he say it because the media influenced him in a way that's like somehow like sinister? And I'm wondering, like, is making the media front and center a winning issue, or is it just like a way to rally the base, which he already has?
I think something like the matter we're going through with right now, I don't think the media framing is a great focus. To circle back on what David was talking about at the beginning with the New York Times op-ed, I mean, the left does this too. A New York Times headline somehow is going to be the scourge of humanity, as if a New York Times reader reads Tom Cotton's op-ed and is all of a sudden going to be okay with tanks rolling in the streets. They're New York Times readers, for Pete's sake. They're not going to buy that argument. So this is a situation where you're seeing the raw footage. You saw what happened to George Floyd. You see what's happening in the streets. You're seeing the protests. You're seeing the police response. You may interpret that footage different ways depending on your where you sit on the political spectrum. But the media headline or the CNN anchors spin on it, I don't think any of that really is going to affect how the individual person reacts to the whole situation.
Yeah.
What do you think,
so let me throw a couple of thoughts. So first, people who say the media, who use that phrase, mean 2 or 3 great American newspapers, the New York Times, the Washington Post. Who else is there? They mean cable news, especially CNN. They mean snippets of local news. And meanwhile, the vast majority of Americans get their information from Facebook. Facebook is far and away the most important media company in the country. And if you've got a media analysis that doesn't start with Facebook and that doesn't have YouTube as the second most important media company in the country, then you're just, it's like you might as well be talking about handbills and pamphlets and town criers, because the media is Facebook. And this morning, the New York Times technology reporter reported that the number 4 story, the first 3 items on Facebook most shared this morning were items from the Trump campaign, and the 4th was a QAnon post in which someone who's probably an actor, but who black man with a heavy, stereotypically black accent went on this riff about bankers and Hollywood moguls and the media, and we know who he's talking about. And you think, okay, this is a different media problem than the one that the Trump people want you to think about. I would say that the way to think about what the media is in American society is to ask this question: why has one of the features of the world since 2010 been the reappearance of measles? Like that, it turns out the reappearance of measles is the price we pay for having. I mean, I use social media. I like social media. I benefit from it, but everything has a cost, and the cost of Facebook is the return of measles. Last, Trump does it because he can't help it. Trump lives in a world of representation. He's like a character out of that. I don't want to be too highbrow. Baudrillard, the French philosopher, said we're moving from a world of realities to a world of representation, and Donald Trump got there first. He watches TV. I think over the past week I have been on foot in the city of Washington for 12 to 14 hours. And that's nothing like what a good reporter would have done. But Donald Trump spends 12 to 14 hours a day watching television. All he doesn't know, and one of the things that is crazy here is even when you're in a scene that's a little sort of more contentious in Washington, you realize how much you have to shrink the aperture of the camera so that you don't see the people walking dogs. And you don't see the boys and girls holding hands. You don't see the 7 Marines who are in jogging clothes, jogging past the scene. And it's a very, except for that one bad night, it's been very, very quiet. So he is talking about the only reality he has. I think for people like Lindsey Graham and more of the Republican world, what they're dealing with is this problem, which is that there is, among the people who are highly politically involved, the 3 million most politically connected people in America, that 1%, everyone's got grievances, and the Republicans basically speak more to people's grievances that although they're reasonably economically successful, they don't feel culturally successful. And the Democrats speak to people who feel reasonably culturally successful, but not so economically successful. And so that's when they talk about the media, that is a way of sort of making real and tangible this feeling like, I'm a very successful car salesman, and yet my sister-in-law, the English professor, always talks to me like I'm an idiot.
All right, so I've got a couple more questions in the queue. I would say if you have a question, please type it out in the chat right now, because we're at the hour mark here. David has been so generous with his time, and is asking a lot for somebody to subject themselves to questions from the peanut gallery, all of us, not knowing exactly who the questioner is going to be. So I really appreciate it.
I'm delighted to meet her. I mean, and
it's fun.
It's fun, and what you attract a high quality cocktail party here.
This is a good.
Even though it's not in Georgetown.
Yes, I don't do Georgetown, but have a drink. But let me ask you this, David, and while people come up with their questions, I heard you recently on a podcast, the Femsplainers podcast, with your wife.
Yes.
Who is delightful. She has been on this podcast.
Yes.
And
she's a big admirer of yours.
And I'm a fan. I'm a fan as well. And the chemistry, now you would hope that the chemistry is good between a man and his wife, but the chemistry is so good. Like, you two love and respect each other, and it is so obvious. And I would love to just get some advice from you on, parenthood, fatherhood, and being a husband.
Oh boy. I'm more a practitioner than a guru on this. So I'm sure you have children, right?
Yeah, we've got 2 boys.
Okay, so that theory, that joke that when I started, I had a lot of theories and no children, and now I have a lot of children and no theories.
Yeah.
That I don't know. I mean, Danielle and I have been married a while. That's true. And I don't know that advice. I mean, I think marriages are so different, and there's so many ways that people can be happy. And I like to say, you know, and the problem with the advice is, when I met Danielle, I didn't follow any advice at all. And I sort of look back on that time in my life, and I said, if I could see that guy again, I would not let him buy a new refrigerator. He was so out of his mind. So I don't know. So I made the decision in not the most rational phase of my life, but you know, it worked out. But maybe there is one thing to say, which is when, especially in a coronavirus situation like this, we're all kind of the conscious effort to think repeatedly of emphasize the positive. You know, everyone does things that bother somebody, and you know, even in the most intimate marriage, there are things that each of you will do that will bother the other, and you can opt to think about those, or you can opt not to, and to think about the wonderful thing they did or the wonderful thing they said, and maybe that leads to this is as I yammer on endlessly, the one useful piece of advice. Okay, here I've got one useful piece of advice. When I talk to people who are sort of in the dating market, they tell me what they're looking for. And I always write, you should think less about finding the right person and more about being the right person. Because probably if you've been having trouble in your dating life, it's probably you, not them.
Yeah.
And how
by the way, David, I don't want to interrupt you, but I think that's advice for everything. If you want to be a pundit who gets on TV, I always tell people, don't try to get on TV. Try to be the type of person that they would want to get on TV. So I just think that's, like, in general, the way to the philosophy.
Right. So just
interject. I'm not sure that's in today's media, isn't the kind of person you want to get on TV someone who's quite inflammatory, who hasn't necessarily got anything, I don't know, good.
Yeah,
it's just how inflammatory you can be. So people on the right, like.
Yeah, but I agree that. No, I think you're right, but in my opinion, that won't make you happy. So the right philosophy is, don't try to get on TV. Try to be the kind of person that they should want. Maybe it's not that would get on, but that they should want to invite on. And I think that's the same thing that David was talking about in a relationship.
Well, and that's the TV point. I mean, you know, I'm not wearing my reading glasses, so I don't. So I'm afraid your name is a little bit of a blur to me. But
don't worry about it.
Is it
Jade?
Jide? Jade? Okay, I'm sorry. I can't. I'm not wearing reading glasses, so I actually cannot see it. But I'm sorry. But it's true. You know, Tammy Laren cracked the code. How do you get on TV? She figured it out. You be you dye your hair blonde, you wear a tight dress, you say inflammatory things, and you'll be on TV. I tried
that, and it didn't work.
But Matt's advice is right. Is right that it is true. He's exactly right. She figured out what did they want, and she became that, and she got her reward on TV. And then the question is, okay, it's like a monkey's paw situation. That if you want to be on TV, that is how you get on TV. And then you have to say, is this something I should want? You know, I think if that's the price, like, there are all kinds of success that have different kinds of prices. And sometimes you say, you know what, that particular success, I'm not going to pay the price for it.
But I interrupted. You were saying work on yourself. Yes. Don't try to get girls if you're a young man. Like, work on being a good person.
Well, no, of course you go try. Like, that's a second. Then we have this whole problem of today's millennial generation, where everyone is having such a good time on their own that no one ever. How is the human race to be carried on?
We have the internet, man.
Right, exactly. But what I just mean is, when you are in, once the relationship is there, that you have to really think all the time. Turn inward. Am I doing the right thing? Am I being the person, the right person? And that, you know, that, because what you find is, if you're that person, there are actually quite a lot of people you can be happy with.
Yeah. All right. Let's see. DZ Man. Every time we go through this, can we change our Zoom handles?
Oh, you want me to have my actual name? It's David. It's David Zimmerman.
Code names.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. All right. Well, I just want I guess if I can keep from stuttering too much, I do not desire to be a television personality because I would bumble and stumble way too much. No, I just want to make a comment that like Matt and David are two of my favorite conservatives because like Jennifer Rubin and Michael Gerson, I of course defined the good conservatives as those who turned on Trump. So one of the things I like about DMC is especially is the times when Matt describes his returning to a Thanksgiving or a family visit, and he says, "Boy, yes, I'm a conservative boy, but I'm like Malcolm X compared to these guys." That's I have that same deal. My pretty much my only family right now is my cousins, and I go there and I visit them, and there are many of them staunch pro-Trumpers, but I pretty but at one point I've got even one of them to say, yeah, he's a con man, yeah, sure. So I guess my question was, how can you get someone a Republican who even admits this that that Trump's a buffoon and incapable to vote for the Democrat when they consider Democrats in general to be godless, baby killing, all these many terrible things. It's like I don't know. It seems like it's impossible, and I've certainly given up trying myself.
Well, as you can imagine, if you were on the receiving end of it, we don't get talked into things that way, and and we get talked when our minds are changed. They're changed by people with whom we feel some profound affinity, so that's the first step, is you have to build the affinity, the rapport, the things you have in common. And you have to then, if you're trying to change people's minds, you change their minds based on things find 9 things they believe and work from the 9 things they already believe. You don't try to change, you will not change the total belief system of an adult person unless they go through a very, very traumatic experience, which we would wish on nobody. But you can change practical applications of their worldview. But the other thing I would say about this is you don't need to change so many minds to change the outcome of an election. And when you're with your particular relatives, I assume the people who are talking this way are all men.
For the most part, yeah. They're farmers. Kansas, Sumner County, Kansas farmers. That's wheat farmers.
So look into the eyes of their wife or girlfriend and just see how enthusiastic is she about all of this. And if you see little glimmers of silent dissent, talk to her.
Okay, maybe so. Thank you. Anyway,
all right, guys. It's been such a pleasure, and what an interesting group of people. I'm so
man. Thank you for taking the time. It's a lot to ask. We subjected you to.
No, it's great. It was great, and you have great friends. So thank you. I was delighted to be asked.
Everybody, go get the book, right? Trumpocalypse. What else? Let's plug some stuff. How can they?
Okay. I'll tell you one thing. So unfortunately, I can't sign books these days, but we printed these. So if you have the book and would like a signed book plate, just email me via the davidfrum.com site, and I'll just put it in the mail to you. And just make sure I have a physical mailing address.
Excellent. Well, this was an amazing discussion. Thank you to everybody who joined us on Zoom. Sorry we couldn't get to everyone, but it was pretty amazing. And David Frum, man, you put in the time. Congratulations on the book. Everybody buy the book. Thank you for being here on the news.
I'll buy the book and I'll buy the other book too.
Yes, get 2.
Too. All right. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Take care.
See you guys later.
Thanks.